Get out of my boardroom. You're senile. My son hurled those words at me in front of the investors. I was 60. I glanced at his precious $50 billion merger and simply said, "Enjoy it." The next morning, the bankers flooded into the office, white as sheets. "You idiot," one of them snapped at my son. "Your mother holds 51% of the voting shares. She just vetoed the merger and fired the entire board." Keith went rigid. "I'm glad you're here with me. Stay with my story until the end. And write in the comments which city you're watching from so I can see how far my story travels. I never thought the boardroom I'd helped design would turn into the scene of my public execution." The mahogany table stretched before me like a war zone, its glossy surface reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights above. I'd spent 23 years in meetings at that table. But today felt different. The hum of the air conditioning sounded louder than usual, or maybe it was just my nerves, turning every sound into something sharp. The familiar smell of coffee, usually comforting, now made my stomach twist. Keith stood at the head of the table. My son, the CEO of Sterling Solutions, the company I had started in my garage 43 years earlier. At 41, he owned the room with the kind of confidence I used to be proud of. His tailored navy suit sat perfectly on his frame, his hair carefully styled, every detail projecting success. Yet, the way he looked at me that day made my chest constrict. "Gentlemen," Keith began, addressing the investors and board members, his voice carrying that authoritative edge I'd once coached him to use. "Before we finalize the details of our $50 billion merger with Morrison Industries, I need to address an uncomfortable matter." My fingers tightened around the leather arms of my chair. Something in his tone slid a cold blade down my spine. Roger Whitman, one of our longest-serving board members, leaned back with his usual smug expression. At 55, he'd always treated me like some outdated artifact that refused to retire. Beside him sat Frank Morrison, representing the acquiring company, his pale blue eyes fixed on me with thinly veiled impatience. "As you all know," Keith continued, letting his gaze settle on me with something disturbingly close to pity, "my mother has been struggling to keep up with the complexities of modern business." The sentence hit me like a punch. I opened my mouth to speak, but Keith raised a hand. "Please, Mother, let me finish." Mother, not Mom, not even Renee. Mother, like I was a distant obligation rather than the woman who raised him. "The truth is," Keith said, turning toward Frank, "she's been increasingly confused about company operations. Yesterday she suggested we renegotiate the merger terms because she thinks we're selling too low. She doesn't understand that $50 billion is the opportunity of a lifetime." Heat burned in my cheeks. I'd suggested renegotiating not because I was confused, but because I had actually read the fine print. The deal would gut our employee pension fund and erase our profit-sharing program, benefits I had fought for, tooth and nail, for decades. "Keith," I said quietly, trying to hold on to some shred of dignity, "perhaps we could talk about this in private." Roger laughed under his breath, the sound like glass scraping glass. "See what I mean?" he said to Frank. "She still thinks she has a voice in strategic decisions." Humiliation spread through me like poison. These men whose careers I had helped build, were sitting there while my own son dismantled me, piece by deliberate piece. Keith's expression softened just enough to become patronizing. "Mother, I know change is difficult at your age. You're 65 now, and it's perfectly natural for your cognitive abilities to decline, but this merger is happening, with or without your approval." 65. He said it like a diagnosis, as if crossing that number on a calendar automatically made me useless. I thought of all the nights I'd stayed late, building this company while he slept safely in his crib. The sacrifices, the risks, the dreams I turned into something tangible. "I built this company," I whispered, my voice almost lost beneath the soft roar of the air vents. Keith's jaw clenched. "No, Mother. You started a small consulting firm. I turned it into a $50 billion corporation." Silence settled over the room. Even Frank shifted uncomfortably. "Get out of my boardroom," Keith said suddenly, his voice slicing clean through the quiet. You're senile, and frankly, you're embarrassing yourself. And everyone here." His words bounced off the floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the downtown skyline. Outside, the city moved on with its usual rhythm, completely indifferent to the fact that my world was shattering. I rose slowly, my legs trembling, not from age, but from the weight of betrayal crushing down on me. This was my son, the boy I'd rocked to sleep, the child whose scraped knees I'd bandaged, whose tuition I'd paid when money was tight. "Keith," I tried once more, searching his cold eyes for any trace of the boy I'd raised. "Security will escort you out if necessary," he replied flatly. Roger practically radiated satisfaction. Frank looked relieved that the old woman problem was being handled. The others pretended to study their documents or stare out the window, anything to avoid witnessing the wreckage of a family. I picked up my purse with hands that weren't entirely steady and walked toward the door. Each step felt as if I were wading through quicksand. The grandfather clock in the corner, Thomas's clock, the one I'd brought from our house when we moved into this building, filled the silence with its heavy ticking. As I reached the door, I turned back one last time. Keith had already moved on, spreading documents across the table, walking Frank through merger timelines as if nothing had just happened, as if he hadn't broken his mother's heart in front of a room full of strangers. "Have fun," I said softly, just loud enough for him to hear. For a brief moment, something flickered across his face. Confusion, maybe. Doubt, possibly. Whatever it was, it vanished so quickly I could have imagined it. I left the boardroom and walked down the marble hallway I'd traveled thousands of times, past the reception desk where Janet, my former secretary, watched me with eyes full of sympathy and questions she couldn't dare voice. The elevator ride down 32 floors felt endless. I stared at my reflection in the polished steel doors. 65 years old, silver hair smoothed into my usual chignon, the navy blazer Thomas always said made my eyes stand out. I didn't look senile. I looked worn out, devastated, but not senile. When the doors slid open into the lobby, I stepped out into the afternoon. The October air was cool against my skin, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves from the little park across the street. The world went on as usual, traffic, conversations, the steady hum of a working city, but none of it felt normal anymore. I sat in my car for several minutes before turning the key, my hands wrapped tightly around the steering wheel while my mind tried to catch up with what had just happened. My phone buzzed with a text from Janet. "Mrs. Sterling, I'm so sorry. Are you okay?" I stared at the screen, then powered the phone off without replying. How was I supposed to explain that my own son had just stripped me of everything I'd built, everything I was, in front of people who had once respected me? The drive back to Maple Grove Lane blurred past in flashes of autumn color and bitter thoughts. Keith believed he'd won. He thought I was a weak, aging woman he could shove aside when it suited him. But as I pulled into the driveway, past the oak trees Thomas and I had planted when Keith was small, I felt a smile tug at my lips. A small, quiet smile that would have terrified my son if he'd seen it. There was something Keith didn't know about me, something no one sitting at that boardroom table knew, and tomorrow they were all going to learn exactly who they'd underestimated. That night I sat in my home office, surrounded by ghosts. Thomas's old briefcase lay open on my oak desk, its leather softened by decades of use. Inside, yellowing business plans written in his careful script mixed with my own frantic notes from those early years. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, the same patient rhythm that had accompanied countless late nights of planning and dreaming. I poured myself a cup of Earl Grey and let the familiar ritual steady my hands. Steam curled up from my favorite china cup, the one with tiny roses that Keith had given me for Mother's Day when he was 7. "For the best mommy in the world," the card had said in his crooked handwriting. Where had that little boy gone? I opened my laptop and pulled up the company files I'd been reviewing for weeks. Not the polished reports Keith showed the board, but the real numbers, the ones that revealed exactly what this merger would cost our people. But before I dove in, I needed to remind myself why I was fighting for them in the first place. The photo album lay open beside my laptop, pages filled with snapshots from 4 decades of life. Keith at 6 months, sleeping in his crib while I worked at my desk nearby, preparing proposals for clients who always insisted on meeting the man in charge. They assumed Thomas was the mastermind behind Sterling Solutions, never once considering that the quiet woman taking notes was actually the founder. I turned to a photo from 1985, me standing in front of our garage, pregnant with Keith, holding the first contract that would change everything. Johnson Manufacturing had needed a supply chain consultant, and somehow they'd been desperate enough to hire the woman who answered their ad. $25,000 for 6 months of work. It had felt like a fortune. Thomas had been glowing with pride. "You're going to build something incredible, Renee," he'd told me, wrapping his arms around my growing belly. "This baby is going to grow up knowing his mother can do anything." The irony now was almost too sharp to swallow. I flipped through more pages, watching Keith grow from a toddler pushing toy trucks around my office floor into a teenager rolling his eyes at my business advice. There were blank stretches in the album too, periods where I'd been traveling non-stop, fighting to keep the company alive, too exhausted to pick up a camera. Those empty spaces told their own story. The merger document spread across my desk told an even clearer one about Keith. Morrison Industries wanted our clients and our technology. They were willing to pay $50 billion for them, but buried deep in the legalese were clauses that would wipe out our employee profit-sharing program within 6 months. The pension fund would be restructured, corporate code for rated. These weren't abstract figures. They were Janet's retirement, Henry's daughter's college tuition, Maria's dream of buying her first home. People who had stood by me for decades, who had helped build this company brick by brick. Keith knew about all of this. I had highlighted the clauses and left the documents on his desk 2 weeks earlier, along with a note asking to discuss them. He'd never responded. My phone buzzed again. This time I turned it back on. "A9, found something you need to see. Can I come by?" Janet had written. 20 minutes later, she sat across from me at the kitchen table, her expression sober. At 58, she'd spent 15 years at Sterling Solutions, climbing from receptionist to executive assistant. She knew every skeleton in the closet, every hard-won victory. "I wasn't supposed to see this," she said, sliding a folder across the table toward me. "But Mr. Keith left his computer unlocked when he went to lunch yesterday," Janet said. Inside were email exchanges between Keith and Roger from the last 3 months. My stomach dropped as I read them. "Roger, we need to speed up getting Mother out of day-to-day involvement. Her questions about the merger are becoming a problem." Keith, agreed. Maybe it's time to look into conservatorship options. At her age, a few concerned relatives could easily establish diminished capacity. Roger, let's not go that far yet. Public embarrassment might work better. If she's humiliated enough, she might step away on her own. Keith, smart. Your mother was always too proud for her own good. The words smeared as tears filled my eyes. Conservatorship. They had actually discussed having me declared legally incompetent. "There's more," Janet said softly. Page 3. An email Keith sent a real estate agent last week. "Please prepare a market analysis for 15 Maple Grove Lane. We'll need a fast sale, probably within 60 days of merger completion. For estate planning purposes." My house. He was planning to sell my house. "Janet," I whispered, my throat tight, "has Keith ever mentioned what he thinks my role will be after the merger?" She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "He's been telling people you'll be moving to a nice assisted living facility, somewhere you can get the care you need." In that moment, the whole picture snapped into brutal focus. Keith wasn't just forcing me out of the company, he was trying to erase me. The merger money would finance his version of a clean life where I was tucked away neatly, no longer an obstacle or an embarrassment. "Mrs. Sterling," Janet said carefully, "I know it's not my place, but there must be something you can do. This is your company. You built it from nothing." I looked over at Thomas's old briefcase and felt myself pulled back to the night he died. The cancer had been swift, but he'd lived long enough to see Sterling Solutions go public. I'd held his hand as he made me promise to protect what we'd created. "Take care of our legacy," he'd whispered. But more than that, take care of yourself. Keith is young. He'll make mistakes. Don't let him destroy what you sacrificed so much to build. What I'd sacrificed. The school plays I'd missed because I was on flights to client meetings, the vacations postponed for product launches, the endless nights I'd worked while Keith slept, believing I was building him a safer future. I'd always told myself it was worth it, that one day he'd understand, that he'd appreciate everything I'd given up for him. Instead, he'd turned my devotion into evidence of my failures as a mother. "Janet," I said at last, my voice steadier, "I need you to do something for me, but it has to stay between us." She leaned in, her gaze sharp and focused. "I need you to call Margaret Davidson. Tell her I need to see her first thing tomorrow morning." Margaret had been my attorney for 2 decades. More importantly, she was one of the few people who knew about the documents Thomas had insisted on drafting before he died, documents Keith had never seen and didn't even know existed. "Should I tell her what it's about?" Janet asked. I smiled, and this time it wasn't the small, secret smile from the day of the board meeting. This was the smile of a woman who'd spent 40 years learning that the most powerful moves are the ones no one sees coming. "Just tell her it's time to remind my son that his mother isn't nearly as helpless as he thinks." After Janet left, I sat alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the proof of Keith's betrayal. The house felt different now, not as the home I'd lovingly cared for all these years, but as a fortress under attack. I wandered through the rooms Thomas and I had filled with our hopes, the living room where Keith had taken his first steps, the kitchen where I'd helped him with homework while conference calls droned in the background, the garden where we'd planted the roses that still bloomed outside my office window. Keith thought he could wipe all of it away with a few signatures and a well-timed humiliation. He thought I was too old, too tired, too broken to fight back. But tomorrow morning, Margaret and I would show him just how badly he'd miscalculated. Margaret Davidson's law office looked exactly as it had 20 years ago, the same burgundy leather chairs, the same wall of law books that probably cost more than most cars, the same faint scent of expensive coffee and old paper. But sitting across from her mahogany desk this time, everything felt charged. At 62, Margaret had the kind of razor-sharp mind that made opposing counsel sweat. Her silver hair was pulled into a strict bun, and her reading glasses hung from a chain at her neck like a weapon ready to be deployed. She'd been my lawyer since the earliest days of Sterling Solutions, back when paying her retainer felt like a reckless gamble. "Renee," she said, pouring coffee from an antique silver set. Janet's message was intriguing. She said you need to remind Keith of something he's forgotten. I accepted the delicate china cup, my hands steadier than they had been in days. "Margaret, I need to know exactly what power I hold. The real power, not whatever Keith thinks I have." One of her eyebrows arched. Without a word, she walked to the massive black safe in the corner. I listened as the combination lock clicked, then the heavy door swung open. "I was wondering when you'd finally ask about this," she said, returning with a thick manila folder stamped Sterling Family Trust, confidential. My heartbeat quickened. Thomas had insisted we set up that trust in the last months of his life. The cancer had moved too fast for us to talk through every detail, and I'd signed the documents in his hospital room, prioritizing his hand in mine over the legal language on the page. "Thomas was more worried about Keith than he ever told you," Margaret said gently, opening the folder. "He loved his son, but he also saw his flaws very clearly. The impulsiveness, the constant hunger for approval, the way he'd always choose the shortcut over the hard path. Those were the traits that worried Thomas," Margaret said as she spread several documents across her desk. The legal text was thick and technical, but certain phrases leapt out at me. Irrevocable trust, majority shareholder, sole discretionary authority. "Explain this to me as if I weren't a businesswoman," I said, even though we both knew I could dissect contracts in my sleep. Margaret's lips curved in a faint smile. "Thomas set things up so that you, through this family trust, hold controlling interest in Sterling Solutions," she said. "On paper, Keith owns 49% of the company directly, but the other 51%, that doesn't belong to him. It belongs to the trust, and you are the sole trustee with full decision-making power." The realization hit me like a physical blow. "Keith doesn't own the company," I murmured. "He's never owned it." "He's been acting as CEO under the assumption that he's the majority owner," Margaret continued, "but legally, you've had control ever since Thomas passed away 18 years ago." I stared down at the documents, the black ink blurred as my eyes filled, not with grief this time, but with something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. "Why didn't Thomas tell me all this?" I asked. Margaret's expression softened. "He was dying, Renee. He trusted that when it truly mattered, you'd come looking for these answers. He also hoped that maybe you'd never have to, that Keith would grow into the kind of leader who deserved to inherit what you built." I thought of the day before, Keith publicly humiliating me, the email about selling my house, the talk of conservatorship. "That time has arrived," I said quietly. "It has," Margaret agreed. She slid another document toward me. "There's more. The trust also grants you veto power over all major corporate actions, mergers, acquisitions, changes to employee benefits, executive compensation over $2 million a year. None of it can proceed without your written consent." My hands trembled as I picked up the paper. There it was, spelled out in unforgiving legal language. The Morrison deal, the $50 billion merger, required approval from the trustee. Keith's signature alone was meaningless. "Margaret, the merger is supposed to close tomorrow. Keith is convinced it's already done." "Is it?" she asked calmly. I thought of the pensions that would vanish, of Janet's retirement, of Henry's daughter's tuition, of Maria's dream house, of all the people who had trusted me with their futures. "No," I said, my voice steady now. "It isn't." Margaret gave a small, satisfied nod. "Then we need to act fast. I'll file the necessary paperwork to register your trustee authority with the SEC and notify Morrison Industries that the merger requires your explicit approval. That should slow things down." "How long before Keith finds out?" "Likely this afternoon," she replied. "As soon as Morrison's lawyers receive our filing, they'll be on the phone with Sterling's legal team." A slow, fierce anticipation spread through me. Yesterday, Keith had spoken to me like I was a doddering old woman who couldn't follow a balance sheet. Today, he was about to learn that his senile mother was the one holding the entire company in her hands. "There's one last item," Margaret said, pulling out a sealed envelope with Thomas's familiar handwriting on the front. "He asked me to give you this when you activated the trust?" My fingers shook as I broke the seal. Inside was a letter written in his careful script. "My dearest Renee, if you're reading this, it means Keith has pushed you to use the power I left in your care. I'm sorry it came to this. I hoped our son would grow into a man worthy of your sacrifices. But I also knew that might not happen. You gave up so much to build this company and raise our boy. You missed parties and vacations and quiet nights because you were fighting for our family's future. Keith never understood those sacrifices because I made sure he never had to. Maybe that was my mistake. Now it's time for you to fight for yourself. Use this power not only to protect the company, but to reclaim your own life. You are not too old, not too tired, and certainly not too weak to lead what you created. Trust yourself, my love. You were always the stronger one. Forever yours, Thomas." I read it twice, tears streaming freely. Thomas had seen this coming in a way I hadn't. Even from his deathbed, he had laid the groundwork to protect me. "Renee," Margaret said gently, "what do you want to do?" I wiped my cheeks and met her gaze. "I want to go to the office," I said. "I want to be there when Keith learns the truth." "That might not be ideal from a legal standpoint," she cautioned. "It could look like you're trying to ambush him." "This isn't an ambush," I replied, standing up, feeling more solid than I had in months. "It's a reminder. He needs to understand that his mother is not the helpless old woman he thinks she is." Margaret gathered the papers into a precise stack. "I'll have copies delivered to Keith's office within the hour, along with formal notice that any merger negotiations must include the trustee. I'll also draft a board resolution recognizing your authority as the majority shareholder." "And Margaret," I added, my voice cool. I want a full audit of Keith's actions over the last year. Every contract, every hiring or firing decision, every expense above $10,000. Her eyes lit with professional delight. Looking for evidence of mismanagement? Looking for proof that my son has forgotten a company is not a toy, I said. 2 hours later, I sat in my car outside Sterling Solutions, watching employees pass through the glass doors. These were the people who had trusted me to build something solid enough to support their families. Keith was ready to gamble their futures for his own ego. My phone rang. Janet. Mrs. Sterling, you should know, Mr. Keith just got some legal documents. He's been shouting at Roger and Frank for 20 minutes. Everyone can hear him. What is he saying? I asked. He keeps yelling that this is impossible, that it can't be legal. Mrs. Sterling, what did you do? I watched a young woman juggling an armful of files as she hurried inside. 20 years ago, that had been me, overworked, overambitious, convinced that talent and effort could overcome anything. I reminded my son, I said calmly, that his mother is the one who taught him everything he knows about business. I just never taught him everything I know. Do you want me to tell him you're here? Janet asked. No, Janet. Let him figure it out on his own. He's always considered himself the clever one. I'm sure he'll piece it together eventually. I ended the call and leaned back in my seat, feeling lighter than I had in years. By tomorrow, the Morrison merger would officially be dead. Keith would be forced to confront the consequences of writing his mother off as a senile old woman, and I would finally reclaim what had always been mine. The young woman with the stack of files disappeared safely into the building. Through the glass, I could see Keith pacing in his corner office, arms slicing through the air as he argued with Roger and Frank. His face was flushed with rage and confusion. He was about to learn that underestimating your mother is the kind of mistake you only make once. I hadn't planned on going inside, but when I saw Frank Morrison's black sedan screech into the parking lot, I knew I wanted a front row seat. Frank stepped out of the car looking like a man on his way to the gallows. His usually immaculate hair was mussed, his tie crooked. 2 men in expensive suits climbed out after him. Morrison's legal team, no doubt. Their faces were pale, their movements sharp and clipped with anxiety. This was going to be even more satisfying than I'd imagined. I followed them into the building, keeping a discreet distance. Janet looked up from the front desk, her eyes going wide as she saw me. Mrs. Sterling, I don't think you should— It's all right, Janet, I said calmly. I have every right to be in my own building. The ride up to the 32nd floor felt nothing like the one from the day before. Instead of shame and heartbreak, something else thrummed in my chest. Anticipation. The woman reflected in the elevator doors looked composed, controlled, maybe even a little dangerous. The hallway outside the executive offices buzzed with tension. Employees clustered in little knots, whispering urgently. They scattered when they saw me, offering polite greetings and confused smiles. Clearly, everyone knew something big was happening, even if they didn't yet know what. I heard Keith before I saw him, his voice raised, fraying at the edges. The office door stood open. From the hallway, I could see Frank pacing near the floor-to-ceiling windows while Keith sat behind his desk, papers strewn everywhere like debris after a storm. "This is impossible," Keith was saying, his voice strangled with disbelief. "My mother has no legal authority over merger decisions. She's not even on the board anymore." Frank stopped pacing and turned on him. "Keith, I don't care about your family drama. What I care about is that Morrison Industries just received formal notice that this merger requires approval from the Sterling Family Trust, and that your mother is the sole trustee with veto power. That's absurd. I own 60% of this company." Roger, sitting stiffly in one of the leather chairs, cleared his throat. "Actually, Keith, according to these documents, you own 49%. The rest belongs to a family trust your father established before he passed." The blood drained from Keith's face. "That's not possible. I've seen the filings. I know exactly what I own." One of Morrison's attorneys stepped forward, glancing at a tablet. "Mr. Sterling, the documents you've reviewed list your personal holdings. They don't reflect the trust's ownership. Those shares were never transferred into your name." Keith lurched to his feet, knocking his coffee cup onto the desk. Dark liquid bled across the paperwork, soaking the merger documents. "Get Margaret Davidson on the phone. Now." "I've already spoken to Ms. Davidson," Frank said, his tone icy. "She confirmed that Mrs. Renee Sterling has full discretionary control over all trust assets and decisions. The merger cannot move forward without her written consent." "Then call my mother," Keith snapped. "Keith," Roger said cautiously, "after yesterday's board meeting, I'm not sure she's eager to take your calls." That was the moment Keith finally saw me standing in the doorway. His expression shifted. Shock, then confusion, and finally something that looked very much like fear. "Mother," he said, forcing his voice into something resembling calm, "I was just about to call you. There seems to be a misunderstanding about our corporate structure." I stepped into the room, unhurried, taking my time. Frank and his lawyers watched me like I might explode at any second. Roger stared at the floor, perhaps replaying every smug comment he'd made the day before. "There's no misunderstanding, Keith," I said pleasantly. "Just information you never bothered to learn." "Mother, we should talk about this privately," he insisted. "Oh, I think we're well past private conversations," I replied, sitting down in the chair across from his desk. "After all, you didn't hesitate to dissect my supposed mental decline in front of these gentlemen yesterday." Frank stepped forward, desperation creeping into his voice. "Mrs. Sterling, I'm sure we can clear this up. Perhaps we can renegotiate the merger terms." "There will be no merger," I said simply. The only sound in the room was the low hum of the air conditioning. Keith stared at me, stunned, his mouth opening and closing before he finally managed words. "You can't do that. This deal is worth $50 billion. It's the opportunity of a lifetime." "For whom?" I asked quietly. "Certainly not for the 400 employees who will lose their pensions, not for the families who depend on our profit sharing. Those are minor details. They can be worked out." I laughed, a short, sharp sound that made Roger flinch. "Minor details, Keith? Those minor details are the lives of the people who built this company. Their families matter more than your bonus package." His composure fractured. "You're being emotional and irrational. This is exactly why I said you weren't capable of making strategic decisions anymore." "Emotional," I repeated slowly. "Is that what we're calling protecting our employees now?" Frank tried once more. "Mrs. Sterling, if we could adjust the terms to address your concerns about benefits—" "Mr. Morrison," I interrupted, turning to look him in the eye, "your company's history is very clear. 3 acquisitions in 5 years, and in every single one, employee benefits were cut within 18 months. Why would this time be any different?" Color climbed up his neck. "Those were necessary restructuring measures." "And this," I said, "is a necessary decision as well. The answer is no." Keith slammed his palm down on the desk, sending another flurry of papers into the air. "You can't just destroy everything I've built because you're upset about one board meeting." "One board meeting?" I stood up, feeling my own anger rise to meet his. "Keith, yesterday you called me senile in front of a room full of people. You ordered me out of my own boardroom. You treated me like some doddering old woman who couldn't grasp basic business concepts." "I was trying to protect you from what?" I cut in. "From being involved in decisions about the company I created? The company I poured 40 years of my life into?" Roger tried to step in. "Mrs. Sterling, maybe we could schedule another meeting when emotions aren't quite so high." "Emotions?" I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "Mr. Whitman, yesterday you sat in that very chair and laughed while my son humiliated me. You said it was a relief that the old woman problem was finally being handled. Did you really think I wouldn't hear about it?" Roger's face went chalk white. Keith's gaze bounced between us, confusion starting to replace outrage. "Keith," I went on, "I know about the emails, the talk of conservatorship, the plan to sell my house, the nice assisted living facility you've already researched for me. How do you—" He cut himself off, but it was too late. "How do I know?" I finished for him. Because unlike you, I still have friends in this company, people who remember what loyalty actually means. Frank made one last attempt. Mrs. Sterling, if we could just— Mr. Morrison, I said, turning to him, I think it's time for you and your team to leave. The merger is dead, and it won't be revived. Keith can show you out. Frank's lawyers were already snapping their briefcases shut. Months of negotiations had just vanished in a few minutes with the woman they'd likely dismissed as irrelevant. This isn't over, Frank muttered as he headed for the door. Yes, I replied evenly, it is. When Morrison's team was gone, the office fell into a heavy silence. Keith sagged into his chair, staring at the coffee-stained merger documents spread across his desk. Roger had slipped away without a word, no doubt to start updating his resume. Mother, Keith said quietly, we need to talk. Oh, now you want to talk, I said. Yesterday, you wanted security to escort me out. I was protecting the company's interests. No, Keith, I answered. You were protecting your own. There's a difference. I walked toward the door, then paused and looked back over my shoulder. Oh, and Keith, tomorrow morning the board will be meeting to discuss some changes in company leadership. I suggest you prepare. His head snapped up. What kind of changes? I gave him the same small, calm smile I'd worn when I walked out of the boardroom 2 days earlier. The kind that happen when you underestimate your mother. I left his office and walked down the hallway I'd traveled thousands of times before, past employees who now watched me with a new mixture of respect and curiosity. This time, I wasn't leaving in disgrace. I was walking out as what I had always been, the owner of Sterling Solutions. When the elevator doors slid shut, I caught my reflection again, the same silver hair, the same navy blazer. But the woman looking back at me was different, stronger, justified, unshaken. Tomorrow, Keith would learn what it meant to betray the person who had given him everything, and I would finally reclaim what had always been mine. The Sterling Solutions boardroom had never felt more like my room than it did that Thursday morning. I arrived before 8 and took my place at the head of the mahogany table, in the chair Keith had ordered me out of just 2 days before. Sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, catching dust motes floating lazily in the air. For a moment, I was transported back to our very first board meeting in this room, when Keith was still in college, and the company was worth a fraction of what it was now. Janet had set everything up exactly as I'd requested. Fresh coffee in the silver service, copies of the trust documents at every seat, and a stack of audit reports that were going to make for very interesting reading. She'd also added something I hadn't asked for, a single red rose placed beside my water glass, Thomas's favorite. For courage, she whispered when she'd set it down. Margaret sat to my right, her briefcase open, every document and tab perfectly arranged. She looked like a general readying for battle, and in a way, that's exactly what she was. Are you ready for this? She asked softly. I brushed a fingertip over the rose petals. I've been ready for 18 years, I said. I just didn't realize it. The board members began arriving at precisely 9. Roger entered first, looking like he hadn't slept. His normally immaculate silver hair was rumpled, his tie loose around his neck. He stopped short when he saw me sitting at the head of the table. Renee, he said carefully, I wasn't expecting you here. No, I replied pleasantly. I imagine you weren't. Frank Morrison's replacement, David Chen, came in next. Unlike Frank, David had the good sense to look uneasy. Morrison Industries had scrambled to send someone to salvage their credibility after yesterday's disaster, but we all knew there was nothing left to save. Keith was the last to arrive, and the difference in him was striking. Gone was the polished, arrogant executive who'd humiliated me 2 days earlier. The expensive suit remained, but it couldn't hide the defeated slope of his shoulders or the hollow exhaustion in his eyes. He took a seat across from me, the chair usually reserved for visiting executives, not the CEO. No one commented on it, but everyone noticed. Good morning, everyone, I said, my voice carrying easily across the room. Thank you for coming on such short notice. I know an emergency board meeting is unusual, but recent events have made it necessary. Roger cleared his throat. Renee, before we begin, I think we should address the elephant in the room. The Morrison merger is— Dead, I finished for him, permanently. Mr. Chen, I believe your company has already been informed. David Chen nodded stiffly. Mrs. Sterling, Morrison Industries is prepared to discuss alternative arrangements. There will be no arrangements, Mr. Chen, I said, standing. Your company's history with employee benefits makes any partnership with Sterling Solutions impossible. You may see yourself out. Chen gathered his documents, frustration written all over his face. This decision will cost Sterling Solutions billions in lost opportunities. Mr. Chen, I replied evenly, I've been making business decisions since before you were born. I'm confident I can live with the consequences. When he left, the boardroom sank into a thick, uneasy silence. Keith stared down at his hands. Roger fiddled with his pen like a guilty schoolboy. Now then, I said, settling back into my chair, let's talk about the real reason we're here. Margaret? My attorney rose and began handing out copies of a thick report. Over the past 18 months, she said in a crisp, controlled tone, this company has made a series of highly questionable decisions under the leadership of Keith Sterling. The documentation is revealing. Keith's head snapped up. What audit? I never authorized any audit. You didn't need to, I replied calmly. As majority shareholder and trustee of the Sterling Family Trust, I authorized it, just as I authorized the review of your compensation, your expense accounts, and your recent decision-making. Roger flipped open his copy, and I watched the color drain from his face before he'd even reached the second paragraph. Keith reached for his with shaking hands. Some highlights, Margaret continued. Executive compensation has increased by 300% in a year and a half. Company contributions to employee benefits have decreased by 25%. Profit-sharing distributions have been delayed an average of 90 days. And my personal favorite, a corporate retreat in Aspen costing $400,000 for 12 executives. Keith's voice came out as barely a whisper. Those were standard business expenses. Standard? I laughed, the sound bouncing off the glass. Keith, I built this company staying at budget motels and flying coach. You spent more on wine at that Aspen retreat than we used to spend on bonuses for the entire staff. The business landscape is different now, he protested. No, I cut in. You're different. The boy I raised understood the value of money because he watched me work 3 jobs just to keep us afloat. The man sitting in front of me has no idea where he came from anymore. Roger jumped in, desperate to regain control. Renee, I think we're letting emotions interfere with our judgment. Keith has increased profits by slashing employee benefits and inflating his own salary, I finished. Tell me, Roger, were you aware that Keith's annual compensation is now higher than the total payroll of our entire accounting department? The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Margaret drew out another document. And further, Mr. Sterling has been in talks with 3 additional potential merger partners. Each proposal involves significant layoffs. The Branson Group plan would cut 40% of our current staff. The Hartwell Industries offer would move operations overseas. Keith finally found his voice. Those were preliminary conversations, exploratory only. Exploratory, I repeated, letting the word hang between us. Tell me, Keith, did you plan to explore those options before or after you had me declared incompetent? Color flooded his face. That was never— Roger, I said, turning to him, would you care to read the email you sent Keith on October 15th? The one outlining conservatorship strategies? Roger's pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the table. Renee, that was taken out of context. Context? I stood, feeling the full weight of my authority settle into place. The context is that you and my son discussed having me legally declared unfit so you could push through your plans without interference. The context is that you laughed when Keith called me senile. The context is that both of you seem to have forgotten that I am not some doddering old woman you can sideline when it suits you. Mother, please, Keith said, his voice cracking. We can fix this. We're family. Families stick together. The word family hung in the air like an accusation. Family, I repeated quietly. When you planned to sell my house, Keith, were you thinking about family? When you secretly researched assisted living facilities for me, Was that family? When you humiliated me in front of strangers in this very room, was that your idea of family loyalty? Tears were running down his face now, but I felt nothing. Sympathy had died the moment he chose greed over gratitude. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, my voice clear and steady. "Effective immediately, I am resuming the role of Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Solutions. Keith Sterling is terminated from all positions within the company." "You can't do that," Roger burst out. "Keith has a contract." "Keith's contract includes a clause regarding conduct harmful to the company's interests," Margaret replied smoothly. "Conspiring to have the majority shareholder declared incompetent would certainly qualify." I turned to Roger. "Mr. Whitman, your services are no longer required either. Your replacement will be announced within the week." "This is madness," he sputtered. "You can't run this company at your age. You don't understand modern business." "Roger," I said quietly, "I understand business just fine. What I don't understand is how you forgot that I've been successfully running companies since before you finished law school." Keith lurched to his feet, knocking his chair backwards. "This is my life's work. You can't just take it from me." "Your life's work?" I repeated, the words coming out sharper than I intended. "Keith, I gave birth to you the same year I incorporated this company. I nursed you while reviewing contracts. I taught you to walk in the hallway outside my first real office. This isn't your life's work, it's mine. You've simply been borrowing it." He stared at me like he'd never seen me before. And maybe he hadn't. For years, I'd allowed myself to become the accommodating mother, the retired founder who stayed politely out of the way. He'd never truly met the woman who clawed this business into existence from nothing. "Security will escort you both out," I concluded. "Your personal belongings will be packed and delivered to you. Your company credit cards are canceled as of this moment." "Your access codes have been disabled," I said. Margaret handed Keith a thick envelope. "This is your severance package. Standard terms. Nothing punitive," she added. "Frankly, Mrs. Sterling is being more generous than the situation calls for." Keith took the envelope with trembling hands. "Mother, please don't do this. I'm sorry for what I said. I was wrong about the merger. We can fix this." For a moment, looking at his blotchy, tear-streaked face, I almost faltered. This was still my son, the boy I'd raised, loved, and sacrificed for. But then I remembered the emails about conservatorship, the plan to sell my house, the way he'd shown zero regard for me or for the people whose lives he'd so casually gambled with. "Keith," I said softly, "some mistakes can't be fixed. Some trust, once broken, doesn't come back. You made your choices. Now you have to live with them." At Margaret's subtle nod, security arrived. 2 men in dark suits, respectful and discreet. Keith walked out on his own, shoulders shaking with either anger or grief. Roger trailed after him, still spluttering about lawsuits and wrongful termination. When the boardroom was finally empty except for Margaret and me, I sank into my chair, suddenly exhausted. "How do you feel?" she asked. I looked around the room where I'd been humiliated and dismissed as irrelevant, the same room where I'd just taken back what had always been mine. "Like I can finally breathe again," I said. 6 months later, I stood in that same boardroom where my son had once called me senile. But everything was different. The morning sun streamed through windows that, for the first time in years, had been professionally cleaned. Warm light spilled over the mahogany table where 8 new board members sat, studying quarterly reports. Real reports, not the polished half-truths Keith used to present. Numbers that told the story of a company not just surviving, but flourishing. "Employee satisfaction is up 37% since January," Janet said from her place at the table. At 58, she was now our Director of Human Resources, a promotion she should have had long ago. "The reinstated profit-sharing plan and pension contributions have been very well received," she added. "Our financial performance has barely taken a hit," said Henry Morrison, our new CFO, no relation to Frank thankfully. "Productivity has increased enough to offset the added benefit costs." I couldn't help smiling, remembering how Keith had called those very programs outdated luxuries. Turns out treating people well is good business. Who knew? What about the Hartwell partnership? Asked Sarah Chen, our youngest board member at 34. I'd promoted her from senior analyst after discovering Keith had been ignoring her market research for months. On track, I replied, but unlike Keith's approach, we're keeping every single one of our employees. No layoffs, no benefit cuts. Hartwell pushed back at first, but once I made it clear our employees are our most valuable asset, they adjusted. The irony wasn't lost on me. Keith had been laser-focused on selling off the company, and it had never once occurred to him to pursue strategic partnerships that would strengthen instead of dismantle what we'd built. After the meeting, I retreated to my office, Keith's old corner office. Actually, it was my old corner office. I'd moved back into the space I'd occupied for 20 years before stepping aside for him. The view of the city was beautiful, but my favorite thing sat on the desk. A framed photo of Thomas and me on our wedding day, young and determined and absolutely certain we'd conquer the world. The intercom buzzed. "Mrs. Sterling," Janet's voice came through, "you have a visitor. No appointment, but I think you'll want to see him." I didn't have to ask who. I'd been expecting this visit for weeks. Keith looked older than 41 as he sat across from me. The designer suits were gone, replaced with khakis and a simple button-down. His hair was longer, less perfectly styled. The arrogant confidence he'd worn like armor was nowhere in sight. "Hello, Mother," he said quietly. "Keith," I answered, keeping my tone neutral, almost businesslike. "I hear you found a new position." He nodded. "Regional sales manager at Brennan Industries. It's a big change from what I'm used to." Brennan was a mid-sized firm that paid maybe a quarter of what he'd earned at Sterling. No fancy perks, no company car, no corporate card, just honest work for an honest paycheck. "How are you adjusting?" I asked. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "My new boss is 26. She has an MBA from a state school and calls me Keith, not Mr. Sterling. Yesterday she asked me to reorganize the supply closet because she said I needed to understand every part of the business." "And did you reorganize the supply closet?" I asked. He blinked, as if he hadn't expected that question. "Yes. It took 3 hours, and I found inventory tracking errors worth thousands of dollars." He paused. "Turns out there's value in knowing the details." I nodded. "Your father used to say a good executive should be able to do any job in the company if necessary." "I never paid attention to those stories," Keith admitted. "I thought they were just old-fashioned." We sat in silence for a moment. Through the window, people hurried along the sidewalks below, coffee cups in hand, phones pressed to their ears, living their ordinary, busy lives. 6 months earlier, I'd been one of them, walking past the building that housed the company I created, no longer welcome in my own boardroom. "I came to apologize," Keith said finally, "not to ask for my job back, not to explain, just to say I'm sorry." "For what, exactly?" I asked. He flinched at the precision of the question. "For calling you senile, for treating you like you were incompetent, for planning to—" His voice cracked. "To have you declared unfit. And for forgetting everything you sacrificed to build this company, for taking your love for granted, for being so obsessed with my own ambitions that I lost sight of what really mattered." I studied his face, searching for manipulation or self-pity. But Keith had never been a good liar, and what I saw now was something stark and simple: genuine remorse. "I've been seeing a therapist," he went on. "Dr. Williams, downtown. She's been helping me understand how I became the kind of man who could treat his own mother so cruelly." "And what have you learned?" I asked. He drew a shaky breath. "That success without character is just expensive failure, that you can't build anything lasting on selfishness and disrespect, that I spent so many years trying to prove I deserved what you built, that I forgot to be worthy of who you are." The words were exactly what I had wanted to hear for months, but they weren't a magic key. They couldn't undo the damage he'd done. Trust between us had been shattered, and trust, once broken, is almost impossible to fully restore. "Keith," I said gently, "I'm glad you're getting help. I'm glad you're starting to see things differently, but an apology doesn't erase the choices you made. I know. Tears were sliding down his cheeks now. I know I can't fix this. I just needed you to know that I finally understand what I lost. Not just the company, or the money, or the title. I lost you. I lost the respect of the one person whose opinion meant the most. I opened my desk drawer and took out a small wrapped package. I was going to have this sent to your apartment, I said, but since you're here... Keith unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a photo from his college graduation, him in cap and gown, me beside him, pride almost glowing off my face. We looked happy. We looked like a family. I want you to have this, I told him. Not because I forgive everything, but so you remember the person you were before ambition and greed took over. He held the picture as if it might break. Do you think there's any chance we could rebuild our relationship someday? He asked, the question I'd been dreading, the one I'd been asking myself for months. I don't know, I answered honestly. Right now, I need time to heal, and you need time to show that these changes are real, not just convenient. Keith nodded, wiping his face. If I could do it all over, but you can't, I said firmly. None of us can. We only get to move forward and try to do better. He stood, then paused at the door. Mother, for what it's worth, the company looks incredible. Everything you've done these past 6 months, the employee programs, the new partnerships, the growth strategy, it's brilliant. Dad would be so proud. After he left, I sat alone in my office as the afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the floor. The photo he'd held sat on my desk beside the one of Thomas and me, 2 snapshots of happiness, separated by decades of choices and consequences. My computer chimed with a new email from Sarah Chen, confirmation that the Peterson Industries partnership was finalized, another company that wanted to work with us because of our integrity and how we treat our people, not because they plan to strip us for parts. I thought of Keith, starting over at 41, learning humility from a boss young enough to be his daughter. It wouldn't be easy, but maybe that was exactly what he needed. Maybe real character can only be forged through real struggle. Margaret appeared at my doorway and knocked lightly. How are you holding up? Better, I said, and realized it was true. Much better. Any regrets about Keith? She asked. I considered it carefully. 6 months earlier, the idea of firing my own son would have been unthinkable. Now, looking at quarterly reports that showed the company thriving, at employee surveys full of genuine enthusiasm, at new partnerships built on mutual respect instead of predatory deals, I knew the answer. No, I said at last. No regrets. That evening, I drove home to Maple Grove Lane, past the oak trees that had grown tall and strong over the years. My house, still my house despite Keith's plans, glowed warm and inviting in the fading light. I made myself a cup of Earl Grey and sat in Thomas's old chair, gazing out at the garden we'd planted 40 years earlier. The roses were in bloom, red petals bright against deep green leaves. My phone buzzed with a message from Janet. Happy anniversary, boss. 1 year since you incorporated Sterling Solutions. Here's to 40 more. I smiled. She was right. It had been exactly 41 years since I'd filed the paperwork that brought Sterling Solutions into existence. 4 decades of building, struggling, learning, and finally taking back what was always mine. I raised my teacup in a quiet toast. To Thomas, who gave me the tools to protect our legacy. To Janet and every employee who stayed loyal when loyalty looked pointless. To Margaret, who helped me remember my own strength, and even to Keith, who unintentionally taught me that sometimes you have to lose everything to remember who you really are. At 65, I wasn't finished. I was just getting started. The roses outside my window swayed softly in the evening breeze, and for the first time in years, I felt completely at peace. I had work to do, a company to lead, people to protect. But most importantly, I had reclaimed not just my business, but myself. Tomorrow would bring fresh challenges, new opportunities, more decisions. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, in my own home, in my own life, surrounded by the results of 40 years of stubborn, determined effort. Keith had called me senile. I'd proven that age is just experience in disguise, and experience, it turns out, is the most powerful weapon of all. Now I'm curious about you, listening to my story. What would you have done in my place? Have you ever lived through something similar? Tell me in the comments. I read them all, and on the final screen, I'll leave you with 2 more of this channel's favorite stories. They're full of twists, and I'm sure they'll surprise you. Thank you for staying with me until the end.